I just came from Vietnam, kite surfing on the beach where it's sunny all the time. But I've heard you had some really bad weather here, lots of snow. So I come from Alaska, and I went to grad school in upstate New York, so I know your pain. The prize here was so generous. It was really amazing. I mean, it's not only is it actually like a generous prize in terms of what it is, but it has the wonderful intention of trying to help restart or relaunch mid-career. We talked in the festival, and some of the others on the shortlist also talked about difficulties after 3 or 4 books, trying to get review attention, trying to get commitment from publishers. And it really, for me, I definitely experienced it. My first 2 books had full-page New York Times reviews and lots of reviews and attention. And then the next 2, for Dirt, it slipped away to 8 months later, a tiny little piece for the review. And then Goat Mountain, the one that came out in 2013, the same time as the prize, had no New York Times review and no interview that I did, no tour, very little coverage. And it's wonderful to have a prize that thinks about that kind of difficult moment in a U.S. literary career, at least. And it made a difference. So I'm happy to come back and report that it actually did make a big difference. It made people notice. I just won this prize, and I had a book that came out, and there was no attention to it. And so I think it was Publishers Weekly did a long interview with me about why my U.S. career sucked. Why were things happening for me in Europe but not in the U.S.? And that actually got out quite a bit, and I heard quite a few responses, and it got out in the publishing world more. And it helped me in moving to a new publisher, to Grove, for the next 2 books, for Aquarium and then the next one. And I think helped with getting much more review attention this time. This time I'm back to what had happened with my second book, where it's full-page New York Times review this weekend, and it's wide review coverage everywhere, including places that have ignored me before, like Chicago Tribune. And really, I'm just so grateful. I feel like I'm getting a full chance again, that I really have been relaunched because of this prize, and also because of my new publisher, Grove, who are really doing everything possible to, like, physically, beautifully produce the book, and also do everything to try to get it out there, and having me tour around the country for almost a month. So anyway, none of that is to toot my own horn for my book, but to say that really the prize has an effect and does the desired intention of helping to relaunch a stalled mid-career writer. So I'm really grateful for what that did. It really made a big difference. We, of course, write books just because we want to create the beautiful and just writing for ourselves, but it's very nice if the book gets out there and people hear about it and possibly read it. It's very satisfying. So I'll read a bit from Aquarium. This book is a big departure for me. The last one, Goat Mountain, finished 4 books that were all Greek tragedies, essentially, and that had my family in the background. I shamelessly mined all the material from a family that provided great material, 5 suicides and a murder in beautiful locations in Alaska and rural Northern California. I was very lucky in that way. So in Legend of Suicide, we have my father's suicide, we have my murder-suicide of my stepmother's parents in Caribou Island, my mother's family with abuse, my grandfather beating my grandmother, and that kind of thing in Dirt, and the hunting ranch we went to, and kind of brutality and guns and all that in Goat Mountain. So that was very satisfying to write all that, but my family's much happier now that I've moved on to other topics. And they're so happy that this book has nothing to do with my family. I mean, really nothing to do with them. So it's set in Seattle. It's a 12-year-old girl, Caitlin, whose mother works in the container port in Seattle, labor job. And so Caitlin has to find something to do after school while her mother's still working, and she goes to the public aquarium in Seattle every day and looks at the fish, and she meets an old man there who's also interested in the fish, and they strike up a conversation. And it turns out this will change her life enormously. And it ends up being still in the vein of, it's still drama, and it's like Greek tragedy, and that it's actually pretty hard dramatically what happens later in the book. But this one is actually about forgiveness and a family coming back together, and no one dies in the end. So my publishers and agents are very happy about that aspect. It's the first time I haven't had everyone die in the end. So I'll go ahead and read. Last night at a reading, I read the first couple chapters, so I'll read from a little bit farther in this time. I'm just starting with this book doing readings, so I don't really know what to read. I mean, if you want to shout out a page number, I can do that instead. But I'm just afraid if it's too late, there might be spoilers. So anyway, this is, she has a friend named Shalini. There's just been kind of a run-in at the container port with a customs inspector named Bigby. And Caitlin is very tense about this, about what it's going to mean if her mother's going to get in trouble. So I think that's the only background you need. During art period, I made a paper mache of Inspector Bigby. I didn't use a balloon because I was going to be sticking him with a lot of needles. I wadded up newspaper, and I should say, it's a retrospective narrator. It's Caitlin when she's 32, looking back at when she was 12. I'm telling us about that time. So, during art period, I made a paper mache of Inspector Bigby. I didn't use a balloon because I was going to be sticking him with a lot of needles. I wadded up newspaper and then wrapped it in wet strips. I would paint his head red and uniform white. And what is this, Mr. Gustafson asked. Inspector Bigby. Is he part of the Buddhist pantheon? What? Is he one of your Buddhist gods? She said before she worships the fish, this Buddhist fish. Anyway, is he one of your Buddhist gods, like the golden fish? Will he be riding in the sleigh? No. Well then? I ripped Inspector Bigby into pieces, tore at the newspaper, and let it fall to the floor. Then I started crying. I couldn't help it. Great, Mr. Gustafson said. Just what I need. Shalini, can you take Caitlin to the bathroom to cry? Everyone was looking at me. I kept my head down as Shalini led me out by the hand. I could see her golden bracelets, hoops that slid and bounced, and we escaped down the hallway to the bathrooms. We were 12 years old. She didn't have any wise words for me, or even tell me things would be okay. I wasn't able to tell her what was wrong, but I remember standing in front of the mirror, my eyes red, and she hugged me from behind, pressed all against my back, arms pulling tight, her face tucked in close against my neck, feel of her breath, her hair so black against my blonde in the mirror. It's the clearest image I have of us because of that stupid mirror, and my face crumpling in self-pity, like any kid seeing herself cry. The old man knew right away. She goes to the aquarium after this. What's wrong, he asked. I'd found him resting on a bench near the jellyfish. I sat down and leaned against him, and he put his arm around me. It's all right, he said. Cold smell of his coat. He must have just arrived. Very few people here today. Dark corridors, warm and humid and private. Crowded in the summer, but who would go to an aquarium in December? Did you know the jellyfish aren't fish, I asked. That makes sense, the old man said. I guess I didn't really know, though. And they've lived for 500 million or maybe even 700 million years. They're older than anything. I hid against the old man and watched the jellyfish rise and fall, slow pulse of life, made of nothing, from another world. I can't imagine 700 million years, he finally said. It doesn't mean anything to me. 4 or 5 times as old as dinosaurs. But who can look back before dinosaurs, before sharks? It's the same as trying to imagine, well, I don't know what. South America would be part of Africa then, I think. Or who knows? And no birds. Can you imagine no birds? And nothing yet learned to crawl. I guess there were plants, but what kind of plants? Were there even plants? Maybe a few ferns? There were no plants, I said. No plants on land. Holy smokes. I wish we had a box jellyfish, I said. Why is that? They have 24 eyes and 4 brains, and 2 of the eyes might be able to see. What do you mean? Don't all eyes see? They only sense light, jellyfish eyes, but the box jellyfish might be able to see. A jellyfish might have been the first thing to ever see. Where do you learn this stuff? Fish Mike. What's that? He gives a talk here every 2 weeks. The last one was about jellyfish. What else did he say? That 100 years from now, most of the fish might be gone, and we might be back to only jellyfish. He said we should enjoy the fish now because this is a last look. I still can't believe there are no plants, the old man said. I'm imagining a world of only rock and sea, nothing else, just rock and sea. And the only thing living in the sea are jellyfish. They have the entire planet to themselves. And now I hear they're getting it back, as if time is reversing. You're only 12 years old, but do you know that what you've said today is more amazing than anything I've heard in my entire life? I sat up and looked at the old man. I thought he was making fun of me, but he wasn't laughing. He seemed serious. He put his hand on my head, the way my mother sometimes did. Caitlin, he said, I feel so lucky to be here with you. I knew something was wrong. Even at age 12, I knew you don't just meet an old man like this. But I needed him, so I ignored anything that seemed creepy. I settled in against him again, his arm around me, and I looked at the jellyfish and their slow and endless pulsing, heartbeat before there was any such thing as a heart, and I felt my life become possible. The old man had said I was amazing, and in that moment, I felt I might become anything. "So what's wrong?" the old man asked. "Why are you so upset today? You can tell me." I didn't know how to speak about Inspector Bigby. He wasn't just a man. He was part of some larger threat, my mother taken away from me, and I didn't know if we had done anything wrong. I was just afraid, but I was afraid of everything. "I'm sorry," he said. "Caitlin, you're breathing really quickly right now. Are you okay? Are you having some kind of panic attack?" I couldn't answer. "Caitlin, you have to calm down." He put his hand on my chest. "God, your heart is racing. Please say something." The old man let go of me and stood up. "I've never been good at this," he said. "I'm sorry, I have to go." He left then, walking very fast for an old man, running away, and it seemed like he was rising uphill, the floor tilting, and I was sliding downward. "Please," I said, but my voice was so quiet. I was alone in this thin, dark hallway, fallen to the bottom, and I curled on the bench and watched the jellyfish above. Rings of light, moons come alive. My heart felt made of rock, dark and hard, but the jellyfish were made of something calmer, reassuring. Slow drift endless, begun so long ago. They were beautiful, and if you looked at them long enough, you could believe they were made only for beauty. We know so much more now about ocean acidification, and I should hate the jellyfish as a sign of all that we've destroyed. In my lifetime, the reefs will melt away, dissolved. By the end of the century, nearly all fish will be gone. The entire legacy of humanity will be only one thing, a line of red goop in the paleo-oceanographic record, a time of no calcium carbonate shells that will stretch on for several million years. The sadness of our stupidity is overwhelming. But when I watch a moon jelly, its umbrella constellation pulsing into endless night, I think perhaps it's all okay. My mother was able to live without a future. This was perhaps her best quality, that she never despaired, and she knew when to cheer me up. That evening, instead of driving home, we went for pizza and a movie, and it wasn't a date with Steve. I had my mother all to myself. The pizza had artichoke hearts, like jellyfish gone opaque and yellowed, washed up on a beach of dough. "I watched the jellyfish today," I told my mother. "How are things going for them? Any big changes?" "Mom." My mother was smiling. "Have they noticed yet that they're in a tank?" "They might have been the first things to see, ever." "What do you mean?" "I mean nothing else could see. There was this whole world and nothing could see it." "That is cool, I have to admit. You're a trip, Caitlin. I never thought of that, the planet before anything could see it. There might as well have been no day, no light." "Yeah." "And then the jellyfish opened their eyes." "Yeah." "I imagine them like dogs sleeping on a carpet, slouched down, and then one of them puts its head up and takes a look." "Mom." "Sorry, I'm not a fish head like you. I don't see the world as fish. I see dogs." "Can we get a dog?" "Caitlin, you know you're allergic." "I want one anyway." "That's my daughter. I'm just like you. I've always wanted the things I can't have. But the trick is to just focus on the pizza and enjoy the salt and cheese. And then we watch a movie, and then we go to sleep. Close your eyes now and enjoy the salt and fat." I tried it. I closed my eyes and focused on salt and fat and oil, and it was good. I was only a mouth in the darkness. I watched only a few parts of the movie. Mostly I watched the shifting light on the balconies above us, great rock formations on a seawall extending upward to a surface I couldn't see. We were set back in the lowest cave, the safest place, in the largest school, all hung vertical like razorfish, but not inverted. The roof above us, the floor to another cave. All eyes peering outward into endless expanse, open ocean, heavy curtains on the walls and folds like dark, rippling of light in the depths, always seeming to come closer. The faces around me all registering the same emotions at once and maintaining perfect spacing, flash of cheeks as they turned their heads and then gone in darkness again. Crunching sounds as they fed on the reef. Sorry, always feeding even as they watched. All was the same as when I watched TV with my mother at home, except now we were in a large school. 2 of us or 200 of us, there was no difference. All silent still, watching, looking outward into the light, waiting, and the sea itself unchanged, sound magnified, booming, and only sound marked time. Even as a kid, I felt this sense that there was no why to any fish or person. The school could be 199 instead of 200, and this would have no effect on the ocean, no effect on sound or time or light. I was always vanishing. In that theater, I appeared and disappeared and reappeared, all without effect, and the rock above remained constant, and the formless air. I tried to do what my mother did, tasting the salt and fat and oil, and now watching patterns of light before sleep, but I could never immerse. I was never able to find my way into any tank at all. We drove home in darkness, this car, the smallest cave, glow of instrument lights on my mother's face, moving at impossible speed, as if our wheels had no contact with ground. My mother lost in the movie still. She had grabbed my hand in the tense or sad moments. I don't think she was even aware she did it. Immersion came naturally to her. When we arrived home, she was tired and quiet, and we simply went to bed. She didn't make me go to my own room, but her bed might as well have stretched hundreds of feet across. The freedom of pizza and a movie was over. Now there was only her exhaustion and another day of hard work waiting after a sleep too short. Too soon we were back in the car, driving again in darkness, north in a stream of lights, some massive current sweeping all of us toward the greater light. Seattle, something resting on the ocean floor, enormous starfish with bright ridges and fingers of black between. Bioluminescent glow pulling everything near, individual lights of aircraft in the depths above like deep-sea anglers, their bodies invisible, shapes drifting through darkness and cold and no sound, nothing known. And I'll stop there, it's just in the middle of the section, but it just gives you a little bit of sense of Caitlin and her mother and Caitlin and the old man. And I really, I usually keep the reading portion fairly short because I actually like questions and the conversation part. So I think I might just stop there and do questions. If it turns out there's no questions, I can, of course, read another section. Oh, sorry, I should have said that before. It's 1994 in Seattle, and it's sort of pre-everyone having cell phones. And it's when I went to the aquarium. I went to the Seattle Aquarium, and the descriptions of the fish next to the tanks were really inspired that year. Each one of them seemed to indicate something about human behavior, some lesson in life. They didn't seem to be about the fish at all. And I always had in the back of my mind, I really wanted to write about that. I've always loved fish. I grew up in Alaska, and like the first salmon I caught was taller than I was, and my grandfather caught a 250-pound halibut. And, when I was Caitlin's age, I had 8 aquariums scattered throughout the house. So I always kind of wanted to write about them, but writing for me is always really delayed. The novel Dirt was based on the second short story I ever wrote, like 25 years ago, and Goat Mountain was the first story that I wrote just before that. And Caribou Island I'd written 50 pages of 12 years before, and this I'd kind of been meaning to write in 1994. There's always a long delay. There's this one website called fishbase.org, and it's great because it has all the species of fish, and people upload photos, and it has all the scientific information about it. And it's an interesting community. Like we had to get permission for the photos. There are actually color photos in the book. And we had to get permission to use these. And this woman, for instance, who did the 3-spot frogfish, this is a super rare photo. A 3-spot frogfish, like guarding a bunch of eggs. No one gets that photo. It's incredible. And she did it at night, and she had to have special lighting systems. And she was really hesitant to have her photo reprinted in a book. She wanted to be very careful about how it was going to be treated. It was like sacred to her, This is like her most important photo ever. So I love that community of people on fishbase.org. But I didn't do other research. When I write, I have no plan, no outline. I never know what the book is going to be about. And what I have is always a character with a problem and a landscape. And in the books before, I have these natural landscapes in Alaska and rural Northern California. And as I describe the forest or the ocean, it acts like a Rorschach test, like an ink blot drawing. It's impossible to describe a forest or water without having it take shape and form and meaning. Our minds are really pattern makers. We can't look at the natural world in a neutral way. And that's the method in all my other books, is to describe the landscape, a place that I grew up in Alaska, which was important to me, where I have a connection. And as I describe it, it becomes strange. It shifts and changes shape and starts to suggest things about the inside life of the characters and also the themes, what the book will be about. And that's actually part of a big literary tradition in the U.S., a landscape tradition. The biggest literary tradition we have in the U.S. is actually regional and rural and focused on the rural landscape. And it's always through those descriptions of the external landscape that you get theme in books. The most noteworthy at the moment would be Cormac McCarthy. In Blood Meridian, for instance, he talks about the mountain ranges, the mountains on the sudden skyline, stark and black and livid, like a land of some other order out there, whose true geology was not stone but fear. As he takes a description of real mountains and extends the geology of them from stone to fear, from the concrete to the abstract, he extends that description into theme and vision, what the book is about. It's about America being born in war and having a future of endless war. It's the American Southwest as an inferno. And it's a great book because of those landscape descriptions and what they do. And to me, it's the only real pleasure in writing, is the strangeness of it. Basically being able to come directly into contact with an unconscious or subconscious mind that's making pattern beyond what my conscious mind can make. And I actually think an idea is the worst thing that can happen to a writer. I always stay out of the way. I try not to have any ideas about it. But the challenge in this one was that I didn't have an external landscape. It's the first time I've set a book in a city. And so, as you saw just in the end of what I was reading, Caitlin views Seattle as if it's underwater, as if it's a natural landscape. And the planes flying overhead are like deep sea anglers, the lights at night, the Seattle south like a jellyfish or a starfish. And the fish were the other landscape that I really wanted. So I've loved fish all my life, so I didn't really have to go research to find them because I have many favorites already. But then I had such a great time going to Fish Base and just looking through the photos, and then when one was suggestive, I would just look at that and start describing and see where that went. And that's how a lot of the book ended up coming about. Yeah, there's constant heavy clouds and rain, and there's this oppressive kind of loneliness and isolation and desolation, like in my novel Caribou Island, which is set in Alaska and has a lot of weather in it. But Caitlin in this book is this very positive person who manages to get past that, and despite all the kind of conflicts in her family, and to become really kind of bitter conflicts at one point, she holds to a kind of generosity. But yeah, I like describing the weather of Seattle. It's really fun. I mean, there's so many different things that rain can do in Seattle, and those thick clouds, there's all kinds of different ways they look. They have as many different looks as the sea does. I've done a lot of sailing, like 50,000 miles offshore, and the sea has never been the same twice. I mean, it's really incredible how in each moment it looks different. The quality of light on the surface and the shapes of the waves and how it relates to the sky. It's really beautiful. Oh, do they mean something specific to her? No, it's just she loves them. Wants to hug them. So, yeah. I think it's just a way. When Caitlin and the old man talk about the fish, they inevitably end up talking about themselves, and so it's just that third thing that allows them to reveal themselves and to think about who they are. They've moved from the exotic saltwater fish are all beautiful and all that. They see just the trout, and the old man's like, well, that's boring. That's just like us. It's like the people of Seattle, cold and huddling together. So they just see themselves in the fish. I've written 7 books in 7 years now, and it's been the most productive time of my life after like outrageous failure all the years before that. So each of them takes 6 months, essentially. It's pretty much like April to October each year. And each time I don't know what I'm going to write, and then I usually start writing some novel and write about 3 pages, and then ditch it and write the one I'm going to write. So it's usually not premeditated even by a day. And then I just write it from the beginning to the end, and it's published the same as the first draft. Like Goat Mountain, the last one, didn't have a single paragraph added or cut or moved. So it's different than what I had been told. I had been told that writing was 95% revision, and you should have a plan and an outline. And for each writer, writing's different. And for me, everything I worked really hard on, I thought was my serious work, had to be thrown away. And everything that came quickly and I enjoyed and didn't revise, it got published. And I think it's because just that same aspect I was talking about before, where it's unconscious in the composition. But the other thing is that I write drama. And if you do actually write drama, you can't cut or add a scene later. It doesn't make sense, because drama is the interaction of characters who are struggling with each other, and what happens in their struggle, what they do and say creates the next scene. And then that creates the next scene after that. So if you take one scene out, now there's a hole. It wouldn't make sense. They couldn't get from this to this anymore. And if you added something in, that wouldn't make sense because it would have no effect. It would be, some strange thing that happened without affecting their life in any way. So it kind of makes sense to not revise if you write drama. I love Greek tragedy. I'm really a neoclassical writer doing exactly what the Greeks did 2,500 years ago. It's all close relationships in a family, just two main characters in each piece with a couple supporting characters. They're acting unconsciously and out of control. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And the main mystery in Greek tragedy is, why do we hurt the people we love most? Why is it that families tear each other apart in terrible ways? Why is it that someone hurts the person who really is the most important person in their life? It seems relevant still to me, the Greeks, because it's what my family still does. My family still is living Greek tragedy, and I'm doing it too. I'm living my life very unconsciously. I don't know why I make any of the big decisions, and my life feels very out of control. I like to think I know what I'm doing, and then it turns out later I find out I didn't, and that happens over and over. I'm especially good at repetitive mistakes. That's my specialty. Each one in the family has to find their niche. But what I love about Greek tragedy also is that a taboo is crossed. Something terrible happens that breaks the rules that hold us together as families and larger social groups. And once that rule is broken, then all the rules are questioned. So you have to think about, well, what is it that holds us together? And what is it that makes us human? So I think Greek tragedy is really productive in that way. And even if it turns out the book's not tragic by the end, if it participates in that dramatic tradition where the characters act unconsciously and are affecting and manipulating each other in these strange ways, it's still that same thing, I think. Yeah, I spent months on each of them trying to be careful and doing line edits and such. And for each of them, I cut maybe 1,000 words out of 60,000 words in line edits, like little pieces of sentences here and there. Mostly grammatical morphemes, cutting those out. But yeah, I didn't actually. It varies for each book. For Dirt, I added 3 or 4 paragraphs. For Goat Mountain, nothing. For Caribou Island, it was 7 paragraphs some editor asked for background information about the main character. This one, I can't remember right now what I did on this one, actually. I've written 2 books since then, so it's hard to remember. Yeah, so it's really different than the process that different than what I'd been told it would be. It all changed for me when I wrote my first book, Legend of Suicide. I was working on it for 10 years, and it has a novella in it that I wrote very quickly, right at the end of the 10 years, after throwing all these things away. And I wrote that, half of it in 17 days, sailing from California to Hawaii. And I was having paranoid, I couldn't sleep more than 45 minutes at a time because I had to check all the boat systems. It was my first offshore trip. I was behind financially and struggling buying this boat as a business, and so I was like really afraid. And I had paranoid dreams that islands were rising up that weren't on the chart. And I was reading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, which is very disturbing. And at night, standing on the bow of the boat, it had red eyes from the big 2 windows because you use red lights at night offshore so you don't wreck your night vision. And it looked like a dragon. It was this Taiwanese boat with dragons carved in the wood and these red eyes and 3 sails out and all the bioluminescence in the wake and big waves. And it was a strange and wild kind of ride. And the novella that I was writing completely shocked me with this surprise in the middle that changed everything I'd think about writing, because I thought that it would end with the father's suicide. I was supposed to get closer to his despair and his suicide, finally understand it. But halfway through, the boy kills himself. And it's something I didn't see coming till I was halfway through writing the sentence. He has the gun down that his father's handed to him after kind of a failed suicide attempt. And I realized when he looks at it, he's just going to put it to his head and pull the trigger. And I was so shocked by that. And the next day I went back and I planned to cut that moment and continue on with my plan, because it was my plan, But I reread all the pages, like 80 pages or so, leading up to it, and I could see all this pattern that was leading to that moment was inevitable. And so it was like someone else had written these pages, like I was seeing them for the first time. It was the first time I understood that there's so much more pattern in a text that's unconscious than what I had thought. I thought consciously I knew what was going on. So that changed things forever. And the pages right after that, I could suddenly write these things that I couldn't write before. There had been this transformation by the unconscious in order to open up the story and make possible what hadn't been possible before. So I couldn't write about what it was like to first find out about my dad's suicide, like the initial grief. I'd never been able to write about that directly. And I couldn't write about what his body must have looked like after blowing up most of his head with a .44 Magnum. But the father discovering his son Now it was all flipped, and it was far enough removed that now I could describe it. I could describe the grief on first finding a suicide, and I could describe the body, and I could stop the years of denial about maybe that wasn't my father's body, maybe he wasn't really dead, and finally make him real, like, through the boy's body and that. So that to me is what's tremendously powerful about writing. I mean, it's really redemptive also. It gives you this kind of second chance. It gives you unconsciously a way to be made whole, to take these tragedies from the past that tear us apart and splinter us in various ways, and to try to find some way to knit it all back together, in a different version. So I love the whole process. And so since then I've been really tried not to have a plan and tried to just write every day. It's 7 days a week. It's my substitute for religious practice. It's like an hour of reading through the previous 20 or 30 pages, and it's like a meditation. My mind's going different ways, and then I'm bringing it back, and then it's time to write my new page. And I'm always have doubt at first. I'm always convinced I'll never write another page again. And then I read back again the last couple pages, and then end up firing off a paragraph, and it goes really quickly, like I can type as fast as I can think, and then I keep reading back the previous pages, and then just keep adding paragraphs, and in about 45 minutes I have my new page. And then that's it, I stop. Even if I could go longer, I know that I'll end up taking the easy path. It'll be tired writing, and I wait for the next day so that my unconscious can screw around with it for another 22 hours and make it a little bit of crazy. Yeah, I've actually written a novel about Medea, the one before this. It hasn't been published yet, but I wrote before this. And I've been thinking about her for 25 years. So that's a play whenever a new translation comes out, I read it. Like there's one by Robin Robertson now that's really wonderful, I think. It's a sympathetic portrayal of Medea set 3,250 years ago, following the archaeological evidence and set in that time, unlike Euripides' play where it's set in his time. And it's about Medea as a destroyer of kings who wants a world not ruled by men and is really forced in a way into killing her kids. It's very sympathetic of her throughout. And I love her story and that time period. And I love her as a character because she's set in the time which the Greeks have posited as the beginning of Western culture and literature, 3,250 years ago. All the characters from that time period are demigods. Her grandfather is the sun, for instance. So it's supposed to be the beginning, which is such an interesting move because it ignores or burns away, refuses, blocks out the older world, because it's actually the end of the Bronze Age, the fall of the Hittite Empire, the Egyptians in decline. It's this huge older world that's just come to an end. And they claim that as a beginning, as if none of the stuff before existed. But Medea is a threat that comes from that older world. She's a leftover from the Bronze Age, and she's a barbarian outsider who's coming into Greek society, and she questions and challenges that idea of their beginning and the kind of different aspects of what that beginning means, I think. So I'm really interested in that. And then when I was writing that, I was rereading all the other Greek plays, not every single one, but many of them. And I haven't studied Greek, but every day I'm translating from Latin and Old English. I've translated Beowulf, and I'm just revising my translation now. I've been working on that for about 3 years. And during this last year, I relearned Latin. I let it lapse, which is sad after all the work before to then let it go. But the last year, it's been like almost every day on it. And I've just started a long translation project doing Ovid's Metamorphoses, so that it's like when I did the Beowulf project, where it's something that I'll do for years and will keep me, so I don't lose it again. So I'll keep going through. And I think that those older texts are so beautiful and are really part of, unconsciously part of a heritage that's inevitably in what we're doing, that we're still using the same conventions from the Greeks, and that we have both heritages linguistically from Latin and Old English that we're responding to, even if we're not conscious of that. So we have accentual meter from Old English, the paired heavy stresses. You can see it in Annie Proulx's The Shipping News. She starts with gut roaring, with gas and cramp. He survived childhood, like to ham knuckle buttered spuds. And she's using English Lexicon diction and the meter. And then other writers like Marilyn Robinson in Housekeeping, it's very Latin-y in her language, and she's using accentual syllabic meter. I want the immersion in both those languages every day, because I think that's the only way I can move forward as a writer stylistically. And in Latin, for instance, you see all the buried structures that are in modern English now. So when you say I go to the store to buy some milk, it's actually an ut clause. It's a subjunctive there. I go to the store in order that I might buy some milk. But all of our syntax is like that. It's all elided. There are things that have shifted and transformed and that are buried. And if you want to work in modern English now, it's nice to know, to know what all those echoes are and what those possibilities are. And it's also, in Latin authors, you can see much greater range than in modern English. So when Cicero's on the attack, it's Catiline, you sewer rat, get out of town. When he's on the defense, it's this long swirling sentence, good luck trying to find the main verb or auxiliary verbs or what he's saying. You'd never be able to argue against the guy because you can't even understand what he just said. So it's really spectacular what they can do. But by having everything fully declined, you can have your adjectives and your nouns arranged however you'd like, any place in the sentence, and you can have visual arrangements of the. It's really sound arrangements more than visual, but different arrangements syntactically. So I love all the classics, and I used medieval literature also. Legend of a Suicide. The title really means a series of portraits of a suicide. It's from the hagiographic tradition, writing about saints' lives. The idea that a literary structure can be just a series of portraits, and in a legend or legendary, and that was really freeing for me to think about, that I didn't have to use these other dramatic structures. Because I had a story that didn't feel like a story. It was just all the men who came through our lives afterwards, after my dad's death. And it's a little bit like in the Odyssey, possible suitors for the mother now, and replacement fathers for the son. But it didn't have much structure, so it's just arranged around a series of describing these guys who come through. And that works. It actually is fine. And then my whole book writing about my dad was such a mess. I couldn't figure out how to do it in the 10 years. But I realized that as a series of portraits that all form a debate in style and content, each story is written in a different style, and they disagree about who the father was and what the suicide meant, that something taken together like that, like the Canterbury Tales, where it forms a debate, that's much truer to the real experience, where each of us in the family was driven by guilt and anger and had a different vision of who he was and what happened and what it meant. So I really find that older literature can provide tremendous freedoms. The craziness of medieval literature and all the different kinds of forms they had, like beast epic and stuff that we don't really use anymore. It's kind of wonderful to mine those sources a bit and see if you can use something from that. And then linguistically, of course, the syntax, the rhythmical patterns, that kind of stuff from both languages. And then the Greeks, just that intense focus on the family, saying that the family is what makes us and destroys us. I think it's still absolutely true. And so in my writing, like in Goat Mountain, it's just 4 characters in 2.5 days on a hillside in one location. And they're just in a pressure cooker. So I love the Greeks especially, but all those others also. I did in the books up through Dirt and Goat Mountain, and then the novel about Medea, I used sentence fragments increasingly and tried to heap up content and cut out grammar, and used those paired heavy stresses from Old English. I went farther and farther toward the Germanic side of the language. And a reviewer in the Sunday Times called it gibberish in Goat Mountain. So it's not like everyone likes it. Some people find it really annoying to read. But I like it. I like the idea not because it's an experiment in language, but because it tries to capture a different mind. What I love about Beowulf is not the story. I don't give a crap about the story. But what I love is that I get a poetic mind from 1,200 years ago that feels immediate and feels different than what we have now. Because it's a mind that's seeing the world directly in chunks of content, not so mediated by grammar. And you realize that grammar actually affects so much your sense of self and world, like how you perceive everything. The kinds of shapes of sentences, of how we tell our story constantly, of who we are each day and meaning of our lives and what the world looks like. It's a different world that they have when they have a different syntax. And it's just so simple and direct. It's all compound words. Like the beginning of Beowulf is Hwat Wegardena and Yer Dagum Thead König and Thrym Jefrunen Hutha Eithlingas Ellen Fremedon Ofschild Chefin Schaden Threatun Monogum Methum Meodas et le of teach exede erlas sinthan eras worth verschaft funden. Hethas frofer yabad, and it goes on, but you have like Theod Koningen, like, people kings. You have all these compound nouns, and it's like that. It's just chunks of content kind of blended together without a lot of grammatical arrangement, and it becomes really intimate and immediate in like the Seafarer, for instance, that poem, where he's talking about how cold it was and how he suffered at sea and how he just can't wait to go back. And you really get like who someone was. And you also get the sense that I think something that speaks to our times, which is that they're looking at the Roman ruins all around, a better world, more organized, higher world that they had previously that they've destroyed, and they're looking at the ruins for it. And I think that it's a similar sense to what we have now, the sense of the enormity of what we've done wrong and the consequences of all of that. So, and there are these existential moments that exist in Beowulf that don't in the Scandinavian, the Norse sagas, for instance, the Icelandic sagas. Those are so far away and summarized, and you don't really get moments that you can touch where you can come close. But with the Anglo-Saxons, you really can come close, and you can sense a person, living and breathing and feeling despair and feeling the weather and what that mind is, how it sees the world, how it sees nature. And by the way, I just have to say, Seamus Heaney's translation, if you've read that, you haven't read Beowulf. I hate that thing. It's the worst crime ever committed against Beowulf. No Anglo-Saxonist I know can actually read the whole thing because it's so filled with rage after a couple of pages. He cuts whole lines from the poem, and he adds lines that don't exist. And the parts that people think are poetic, like harped and hooped and purpling with pain, whatever, that's all shit he made up. It's nothing like, there are no H's even in those lines in Beowulf. And then he takes real lines that are poetic and he flattens them because he has a tin ear, because he's a shitty poet. It just pisses me off so much that has been done to Beowulf. Like, so don't read that edition. Like, read a literal translation, not a verse translation, so you're closer, and don't read his. Like, there's this one line, Morthor Ymericad Mandream Fleon, which is murder marked mandream flown. Such a poetic, beautiful line. He has, outcast from society, out on the fringes or whatever. I mean, he just sucks. It's so awful, and he doesn't capture the mind at all. You just don't get Beowulf at all with that. You get Shameawolf, and you shouldn't read it. I know he's much loved. It just drives me crazy even more. After he died, they read the whole thing on Radio 4, BBC again. And then I was on BBC because they had a new edition of Beowulf from someone else, from Norton or something, and I, or some of the publishers, but I was a Penguin. And I was talking about that, and the comments I made about Heaney, they ended up cutting them. They cut all my comments, or they censored me. Because the Medea book was too literary. The publisher said, my previous publisher, not the one now, but my previous one said it had too much focus on language and landscape, which for an American audience especially would be unwelcome. But even European audiences, like the German publishers, don't want it. The UK, Netherlands, France, they're going to go ahead with it. But yeah, it was just too literary. It actually caused a big crisis in me. I luckily had already written Aquarium before I found out that they didn't want the Medea book. So it didn't affect this one, but it affected the next book that I wrote, knowing that actually there are real limitations, that I thought I had earned the right to have a literary career in that I could write whatever I wanted. Even if it doesn't sell a lot, I might be able to at least get published and write whatever I want. And I found out it's not actually true, that there is such a thing as too literary, and that people don't want stories set in the past in a literary way if they're not, kind of, fun historical fiction that, actually has nothing to do with that time period. So, yeah, too much focus on language and landscape. I mean, how can that be? Those are all the pleasures, language and landscape. That's why I write. No one in the U.S., including Grove, wants to do that for a while. I think that they will, because they're a wonderful independent publisher that really commits to an author focusing on their career. And so what my editor has said is that they will do it. But first, Aquarium, they're very pleased. It's finally not a tragedy. The Medea one's very brutal. It begins with she's on the Argo with Jason the Argonauts, and she's cut her brother into pieces, and she's thrown piece after piece into the water to slow her father down. Later she cuts up a ram into a stew, and then a king into the pot also. Then it's a king and his daughter who get killed. I mean, it's the most bloody thing I've ever written. So I can see their point, and I think they're right. It's really my agents pushing more than my editors about having the same book like come out in all the different places at the same time, and they're trying to save me from myself and thinking about how can I have a sustainable career, not just the next book and then I'll never get published again. So I think that it's all for good reasons. And I think the Grove will publish it, but I think we'll probably do the next novel I've written after Aquarium, and then I think they probably want a couple of books to try to rebuild my audience, basically, in the U.S. As I said before, I really did have the mid-career crisis where my audience dwindled to very little. I think the last one, I only sold like 5,000 copies. And before, it's not like I sold a lot of copies here. I sold maybe, 20, 25,000 or something, but I was in danger of kind of going out of existence. And so I really appreciate the efforts by a lot of good people to try to let me continue to have a literary life, to happen. But it did hurt. It hurt to know that I wasn't free to write what I wanted to write. That actually it is true that there is something that's too literary, and that was what I wanted to do. And I wanted to write a next book that would be set in Anglo-Saxon England, and I wasn't really encouraged to do that. Like, I'm supposed to write contemporary novels. A lot of it was just crap. I read a whole novel that was crap also, where it was beautifully structured, but you wouldn't care. You wouldn't read 5 pages and care about it. And I've had my own problems. I had no interference from outside. I got to write 11 books without thinking about the market, really, which is really an indulgence to be able to do that. The fact that I'm having to think about market now, so late, is actually a real gift. Most people get hit with that with their second book, and it kind of trips them up in their writing. So, I've had lots of other problems that were just my own problems.